Hello everybody, it's Savannah again, and I cannot wait to show you how I made this Maria Reynolds cosplay from the Broadway play Hamilton. As usual, I started with a sketch so that I could get an idea of the dress's structural components. Yeah, it's not tight enough, and I was intending for these to be flipped down to where they could just be bound all the way from here to there, but the shape's not quite right.
I know this one was like this stretches a little bit though.
Yeah. I'll use a different fabric for the other one.
Like
it's too long, and these are supposed to go.
Plus, isn't this supposed to be over more?
Yeah, it kind of does more of like a heart shape. So.
I don't know, I think you should try like the stay pattern and see if you can kind of figure that out.
Yeah. This is almost like more over the bust, like a commercial kind of princess theme dress, and not a stay that pushes and makes a cone shape. Okay, we'll go to square 2 or whatever.
Release you.
Okay, I don't have to film that. So these are the 2 patterns that I ended up using. The total back of the bodice is completely the same as the dress pattern, and then I combined the side and front pieces with a stays pattern to make the front portion. As you can see, mock-up number 2 turned out so much better. The bodice actually fits like a pair of stays instead of a commercial costume bodice. Now, this dress isn't going to be for me, but my measurements are so similar to the recipients that I was able to test fit. So for this dress, we decided to use an imitation silk dupe peony. It's the first time that I've ever used an imitation silk, but I was pleasantly surprised by the look and how it was structured. So step 1 to making this dress was to make up the bodice front, which means sewing lots of boning channels. I used my pattern to mark the line placement, and then a ruler and a water-soluble pencil to mark each of the channel lines. I then flatlined this piece with a bit of cotton poly blend fabric so that there would be 2 pieces of fabric to sew the channels in. I also went ahead and pad stitched the 2 pieces together so that there would be no slipping around or making wrinkles. These stitches are not permanent and would be removed later. I proceeded to then sew in the boning channels. You can actually do this rather continuously if you're strategic about where you choose to put in your boning and where you choose to close it off. I chose the bottom in this case to put all the boning in because I knew I would have to finish off the neckline first with the piping, and there would be no way to get those bonings into the channels at that point. I then moved on to making the piping for the bodice. I did this by folding a vise cut strip of fabric over some twine and then securing it down with a zipper foot. I actually don't stitch all the way up close to the twine. I leave a little bit of space so that I can sew up close to it when I actually go to attach it to the bodice. Before securing the piping to the neckline, I first had to put in 2 pieces of boning that I could not get in through the bottom of the bodice. Here you'll see me moving over my needle so that I can sew directly up against the twine inside of the piping. Not all machines do this, but it is really handy. I then serged the neckline to create a nice seam finish. The piping wouldn't fray because it's cut on the bias, but the other pieces of fabric would. I then put in all the boning pieces before tacking down the neckline. I then tacked down the piping seam allowance with a whip stitch, careful to only catch the black flat lining layer and not the imitation silk layer. So here I am layering over the side front pieces over the front piece of the bodice. I actually ended up flatlining these 2 pieces so that they would have a little bit more structure than a single layer. I then tacked them onto the sides with a running stitch. In this clip I'm marking the boning channel placement for the back of the bodice. I decided to use strips of other flatlining fabric to make these channels only in the black flatlining layer so that the boning wouldn't show through to the outside of the bodice. You can't tell because everything is black on black, but I actually had already sewn on the channels at this point and decided to put all the back pieces together, sewing them and then clipping them and ironing them. I then secured these 2 layers with a running stitch all the way around the edges. I then serged all the sides and the back pieces because just like regular silk dupioni, this stuff sheds like crazy. I then chose to mark the zipper fold lines before proceeding to put the bodice together. I did the right side at 1/2 inch and then the left side at 5/8 inch. After that, it was finally time to put the bias tape all the way along the front of the side bodice pieces and to the back, leaving the space open to still put the zipper in. Then finished off this bias tape with a whip stitch. You can also see right here in the bottom right corner that I went ahead and whip stitched down all the interior seam allowances. Now we finally had something that looked like a bodice. Before closing off the bottom of the bodice with some piping, I first had to make the eyelets and put in the ribbon. So I used my mock-up piece to mark where each of the eyelets were supposed to go. I made each of the eyelets by hand because I couldn't tell if there was any metal eyelets on the original dress. These are much more unobtrusive and they didn't really actually take me that long. It was at this point that I decided to put the piping onto the bottom of the bodice just so I could finish everything off before putting the lacing in. Here you'll see me clipping seam allowance. I didn't show you this for the neck, but I did the same thing for the neckline. This allows the bottom of the bodice to be able to flex and move and then to take up the excess seam allowance at the bottom. I do not cut the bias of the piping. I then finished the bottom of the bodice exactly the same way I finished the top. To make up the lacing, I took another bias cut strip of fabric and sandwiched the twine in between it, securing it into the inside corner. I then stitched around the edge of the strip to make the tube. I then turned the lacing the right way out, first using a large knitting needle to help me get it started, and then pulling on the twine to turn it out the rest of the way. Using a reference photo, I then laced up the front of the bodice with a bobby pin and the lacing. You can't tell as much because this is a sped up clip, but it was a struggle. The lacing just ended up being too big and thick, so I ended up turning it all inside out again and resewing it smaller. To start making the skirt, I measured out 2 large rectangles of fabric and then pulled a thread to cut a straight line. After that, I also cut a vertical line up one of the large rectangular pieces. This would be the back seam. I also took the 4 pocket pieces and serged all the way around them. I then pinned each of the 4 pocket pieces to the side seams where the selvage was. I stitched it at 1/2 inch instead of 5/8 and ironed them open. I then took the skirt pieces and pinned them all the way together down the sides. To sew up the side seam, I first sewed down a few inches down the pocket at 5/8 and then around the pocket at 1/2 inch, then back up the pocket at 5/8 again to a marked point and then all the way back down as normal. I then ironed the side seam towards the front of the skirt. Then putting the bodice inside out on the mannequin, I marked where the waistline was supposed to go. You have to do this on a mannequin or a person because the bottom of the bodice will stretch out when it's around someone. You'll see what I mean in a later clip. Here's why you have to mark the waistline on a mannequin, because when the bodice is laid out flat, it will not be a straight line. I wish that I could say for the skirt pleats that there was some beautiful mathematical way to calculate how big they should be and where I should put them, but in reality, it was all trial and error. I had to redo the skirt, I think, 4 times because I just couldn't get it right. No, not done. I still had to figure it out again after this shot. Another thing that was troubling was trying to make sure that the pockets were hidden underneath the pleat and not at the front of the pleat. Here's the final pleat job. You can see both of the pockets right there facing towards the front of the dress. I then whip stitched the entirety of the skirt onto the waistline and then put in a waist tape so that the seam would be covered up and it would help take strain off the zipper. It was finally time to put in the zipper. The first thing I did was sew the zipper onto the right side of the dress, which was the side of the dress that did not flap over the zipper. Once the first side of the zipper was sewed, I then turned the dress inside out and began pinning the back seam. You'll see that I've offset the seam edges a little bit so that there would be more fabric to be able to turn over and flap over the zipper. Then turning the dress right side out again, I pinned down the flap over so that I could sew it down on top of the zipper. You'll notice that I'm first sewing the flap down with the zipper open, but then eventually you have to get down to the bottom where the zipper head is. I get past it by lifting up the foot and then forcing the head of the zipper underneath it. I was super pleased to finally have the zipper in, and then I finished off the vise tape at the top of the neck with a whip stitch by hand. I also decided to go ahead and put a skirt hook into the top of the dress. I also put the same skirt style hook into the waist tape. The dress was now put together, skirt and bodice. I had even already done the hem at this point. I usually will put the sleeves onto the bodice first before attaching the skirt, but I had to wait for the rust colored fabric to do the second layer of the sleeves. But the second fabric arrived shortly, and so I was able to finally cut out the undersleeves. I first began by serging all the top seam edges. Then sewed the top seam edges together, and then began to create the decorative split down the back where there's lacing. Now, I hadn't seen Hamilton at this point, and I still actually haven't seen it, but looking at some behind the scenes photos, I realized that she had the back of her sleeves laced up. So I had to kind of divert my plans. I was just lucky that I actually constructed the sleeves in such a way that I could still do this. You'll see me here ironing down the outsides of the sleeves so that I can create a nice edge. I then finished this all by hand because I just didn't want to be able to see that line all the way around it. So here's a shot of the undersleeve and the upper sleeve together. I ended up doing a French seam inside of the undersleeve just so if somebody looked up the sleeve they wouldn't see the black serging. I would eventually sew up the top seam with just a regular 5/8 seam. And just as I had done for the front of the bodice, I went ahead and marked the eyelet holes and then did the eyelets by hand. After finishing the eyelets, both the oversleeve and undersleeve were finished. I then basted them together with a sewing machine around the top edge of the sleeve. I then made lacings just as before. It was much easier lacing up the sleeves because I made them the right size the first time. After finishing the backs of both the sleeves, it was time to create the drawstrings at the front bottom of each of the sleeves. I did this by lining up the seams on the top of both the over and undersleeve. I then poked a hole through both the oversleeve and the undersleeve except for the very bottom seam allowance. I was going to use this seam allowance for the channel for the drawstrings. I then created 2 eyelets by hand on either side of the seam and then sewed the channels on top through all layers of the sleeves. This was a little tricky because the sleeve was already put together, but I got it done and it turned out actually really great. Then, just as I had done any lacing before, I fed the lacing through the channels with a bobby pin, bringing it all the way to the bottom of the sleeve seam allowance. The only downside to using the bobby pin was that it ended up catching on the serging when I was trying to pull the lacing through. I then secured the ends of the ties with a back stitch and then proceeded to hem the sleeves as normal with a doubled over hem. After that, the sleeves were finally finished. I attached them to the bodice and then brought them to the serger to finish the arm's eye. And with that, the dress was finally complete. This cosplay took me about 39 hours to make, including the bum pad that's pictured with it later. I am beyond ecstatic that Jessi was willing to model this dress for me. It's the first time that we've had a different model besides us on our channel. You can find more from her on her TikTok account at Jessi Wills or on her Instagram at @Jessi Wills. Now, without further ado, the finale.